over now to you, Kaja Silverman.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. This is hot off the press. I wrote it specifically for this event. It turned into a big production again. I'm kind of excited to deliver it. I imagine that it's going to develop into something much bigger. So without further ado, in the last chapter of my most recent book, I recounted a story that began in 1967 with one group of found photographs and ended in 1988 with another. The first group of photographs documented something from which Gerhard Richter had been shielded, both as a child and as a citizen of the GDR, the arrest, deportation, imprisonment, and extermination of Jews and other persecuted groups during the Third Reich. The second group of photographs derived from a later period in German history, one through which Richter had lived, but to which he had no personal relationship. The period that began with the rise of the student movement, led to the formation of the Red Army Brigade, and culminated in the imprisonment and deaths of the three most famous members of the RAF, Ulrike Meinhof, Gudrun Ensslin, and Andreas Baader. Although separated by 30 years and mobilizing different constituencies, these two periods have some striking similarities. Both pushed binary opposition to its absolute limit, the ontological nullification of one group of people by another. Both also affected this nullification in the same way by differentiating the members of this group from the rest of the nation at the level of their very being, imprisoning them in a sequestered zone and declaring a state of exception that curtailed dissent in the rest of the population. The horrors of these two periods of German history were quickly buried. It was as though they had never happened. Richter tried to paint the concentration camp photographs because he was appalled by this erasure, but he did not succeed because he was unable to meet the demand which they made upon him. The emaciated figures who appeared in these images appealed to him to undo the ontological violence to which they had been subjected by acknowledging them as his kin, since this would have required him, as he later put it, to see his own end in theirs. He turned away, but the solicitation continued ringing in his ears, so he tried to silence it by putting someone else in his place. And before I say who that someone else is, I just want to note something that I saw earlier today when Mark was showing this same slide and giving a talk that had to do with the camps. And it's very important to my talk, although I saw it for the very first time, and it's the striped slats in the upper right-hand corner. And that will be, its importance will become clear later. So as I said, he put someone else in his place. Richter connected the figures in the concentration camp photographs with a group of pornographic photographs. He also produced deadly pictures, deadly paintings of some of these photographs, making clear that his goal was to feminize mortality, not to equate pornography and Auschwitz. Death was something that happened to the other, Jews and women. Richter devotes panels 16 to 23 of the atlas to this analogy, but a few pages later, it starts to unravel. Panel 27 consists of two vertically arranged photographs that were presumably shot by the artist himself, with the caption Studio 1967 written below. The photograph in the lower half of the panel, which is only slightly blurred, shows a room lined with photo pictures, indicating that the venue named in the caption is not just any studio, but specifically Richter's studio. Several of the pornographic paintings can be glimpsed in the rear of the image, and 4 of the 8 canvases in Student Nurses, a series that enforces an even tighter join between woman and death, are propped against the right wall. The photograph in the upper half of the panel is a rephotographed version of the one in the lower half, but it is so out of focus that the paintings are no longer recognizable and the room no longer identifiable as a studio. Because this space is so amorphous, it seems much smaller, and the thick black frame around the outer edges puts bars around it. This is a cell, like those in which the camp inmates were housed. But the person who has been assigned to this cell is mysteriously absent. By publishing these photographs together, Richter identifies himself as the missing occupant. He also exposes the terms through which he secured his release. Richter says that a photograph is the first stage in the development of an image, but that this image is not fully developed until the photograph becomes a painting. Although this is certainly not true of all photographs, it applies with uncanny precision to the one on the top of panel 27. This photograph developed continuously for almost 4 decades and emerged from this development process as a painting. This painting is one of Richter's greatest abstracts, Cage 1. Tonight I will be talking about how the photograph from the panel 27 in the Atlas turned into this painting. Since the idea that a photograph could develop into an abstract painting is probably anathema for some members of my audience, this would seem the moment to note that Richter has repeatedly declared that there is no essential difference between photography and abstract painting. Both function in the same way by resembling other things. Quote, "We only find paintings interesting because we only search for something that looks familiar to us," he told Robert Storr in 2002. "I see something and in my head I compare it and try to find what it relates to. And usually we do find these similarities and name them, table, blanket, and so on. That's how abstract paintings work." And although we're used to thinking of the relationship between a photo and its referent as representational, I think Richter disputes that, and I certainly would, that to suggest that this comparison between abstract painting and photography works to redefine both terms, photography as much as abstract painting. Analogy is a relationship of greater or lesser similarity between 2 ontologically equal terms, not a relationship between one thing and something else that resembles it. This makes it a powerful vehicle for undoing binary opposition. Unlike the binary opposition whose lethal consequences are documented in the camp photographs, the ones that led to the deaths of Meinhof, Ensslin, and Bader was enforced from both sides by the terrorists as well as the state. The rage that fueled the terrorists' violence were also generational and informed by what happened in the camps. With it, they simultaneously accused their fathers of murder and proclaimed their own innocence. Richter had remained above the fray because he was horrified by both sides of the opposition and imagined that he stood outside it. But not only was he part of the same post-war generation, but he too had engaged in a sweeping paternal disidentification. His horror was also telling, since horror is the affect that wells up in us when we are confronted with what we have abjected, what threatens to undo us. Richter's nonpartisanship was consequently as problematic as the false analogy through which he responded to the concentration camp photographs. It permitted him not only to repudiate his soldier father and his Nazi uncle Rudy, but also to blame someone else for this repudiation. Richter refers to the kind of double negation that I have just described. He repeatedly refers to it through its linguistic form, neither nor, and this is going to be very important, this formulation. He also associates this neither nor with impersonality and with his gray paintings. In the mid-70s, he viewed the via negativa of these monochromes positively. Quote, "To me, gray is the welcome and only possible equivalent for indifference, non-commitment, absence of opinion, absence of shape," he wrote in a 1975 letter. A decade later, though, he told Dorothea Dietrich that as his paintings became, quote, more and more impersonal, he didn't, quote, feel well because, again, quoting from him, "You can't live like that." He also described his relationship to these paintings in ways that recall the empty cell in panel 27 of the Atlas, when, quote, "Nothing was left but monochrome gray. I was totally outside my paintings," close quote. He therefore resolved, he said, to do the exact opposite, to paint abstract works that are formally and chromatically heterogeneous, but in which everything is still, quote, of one mold. The contradictions have to be there, he observes elsewhere in the same interview, but they have to coexist and diverge simultaneously. Although the ultimate goal of this project remains unstated, it is grammatically implicit. The exact opposite of being outside one's paintings is being inside them. In 1976, Richter did indeed begin painting complicated polychrome abstracts, but they didn't put him inside his paintings. To the contrary, they instantiate an even more extreme and lethal form of outsideness than that represented by the gray monochromes. As has already been noted by many other scholars, these paintings evoke distant landscapes viewed from an aerial position. In some of them, every detail has been evenly blurred, which puts everything at an equal distance from us. At other times, a large stroke or a blotch of paint intervenes between us and this remote topography that has been spared this treatment and consequently seems both closer to us and ominously out of scale in relation to the rest of the painting. These strokes and blotches recall the falling bombs in Richter's paintings of military planes. They also locate him in the pilot's seat. In the fall of 1977, Richter's work underwent another transformation. He began collecting material connected to the RAF, and he dwelt with this material until 1988, when he painted October 18, 1977. I say dwelt because it informs everything he did in the interim. Late in 1977, he photographed and painted his daughter Betty in ways that link her to Meinhof and Ensslin. And in 1988, he reinforced these links from the other side. He painted the two terrorists in ways that connect them to Betty, because I traced this process in great detail in my earlier discussion of Richter. I'm not going to do it here. These analogies permitted Richter to extend the tenderness he felt for his daughter to Meinhof and Ensslin, and so to claim them as his kin. Through this act, he also dismantled the false analogy through which he earlier responded to the camp solicitation, the one that equated mortality with women. The RAF material also introduced a new directionality into Richter's photo pictures. Until 1988, the predominant axis along which his arm moved in the final blurring stage of his photo pictures was horizontal. And when he painted brushstrokes, they too were horizontal. Richter's early color abstracts, as we have already seen, invite us to look down at what appear to be distant landscapes. This is also the position from which Richter photographed his daughter, Betty. He laid her on a table and he stood over her in order to make the photographs. However, he then reoriented himself spatially to these photographs, rendering one of them horizontal and the other vertical. He also blurs one of the canvases in October 18, 1977, vertically, a point to which I will return. As must be evident by now, it is not only Richter's art that is analogical, it is also his world. Some of these worldly analogies are a human construction, but others, like those that link Auschwitz to Stammheim, are forged by history. Still others are internal to being itself. We are all, for instance, mortal. These three kinds of analogies are complexly interwoven. When Richter refused to see his own end in the concentration camp photographs, he repudiated an ontological connection. He did so in a way that linked him to those whose crimes he was so eager to undo. And in the long period during which he lived with the RAF photographs, his unconscious wove a different kind of analogy, one that permitted him to acknowledge the ontological connection between himself and the two women terrorists. Because of the similarities between this chapter of history and the earlier one, the acknowledgement extended backward in time analogically and ratified the ontological connection that he had earlier denied. This is an implicitly Benjaminian account of history. Benjamin's history, of course, also works analogically and also has this possibility of retroactive redemption built into it. Because he moves back and forth between photography and abstract painting and is so open to historical and ontological resemblances, as well as to those woven by his own unconscious, Richter is also constantly discovering new ways of analogizing. In the 60s, he was drawn to analogies in which similarity far outweighs difference, and he found the model for this analogy in photography. Later, he gravitated to analogies in which difference far outweighs similarity, and this has led him to focus primarily on abstract painting. Richter's abstracts are, however, always analogically linked to photographs. Soon after Richter took the photographs of Betty, verticality made its way into his abstract painting, at first through isolated lines and/or the upending of his canvases, and then at the level of facture. This repositioned him in front of what he sees instead of above it. Two of my favorite paintings from this period register the vertigo of this spatial reorientation in an extraordinary way. In the first, Clouds, the earth and sky momentarily reverse their positions. In the second, Dockyard, the ocean and sky assume their customary places in one part of the painting, but not in another, and everything else is frozen in mid-tumble as it careens into place, much as it would be in a photograph. Both of the two paintings I have just described feel topographical, like the earlier color abstracts, but increasingly the analogical work, which is so central to Richter's project, is performed at the level of the facture. Paint is applied to the canvas with powerful vertical strokes and these strokes are irresistibly associative. We see rain, tears, waterfalls. There is clearly something motivating these formal analogies and the affects they awaken in us. They are formal analogs of something that is absent representationally from the painting. Richter titled several of them Tower, and since he painted them for a London exhibition, he must have been thinking of a particular kind of tower, one with cells. Most of these paintings, though, don't even offer us this much help. They are like the outline drawn around a body in a crime scene after the body has been removed. Horizontality also made its way into a few abstract paintings from the late 70s, but these paintings are much less evocative. However, several years later, Richter found an important use for horizontality. Between 1982 and 1986, he painted a number of two-canvas works. Unlike the canvases in a series like Uran 1, 2, 3 that are individual works, both canvases are part of a single work. They are hung side by side, and when viewed from a distance, often appear to be a single canvas. But the dividing line between them, which almost always takes a vertical form, invites us to read each side in relation to the other, i.e. horizontally. This opens the door to a new kind of abstract painting, one that is indeed the opposite of the gray monochromes. Instead of saying neither nor, these two canvas abstracts say both and. Sometimes the two canvases are held together through the recurrence in one of them of the colors that apply in the other, albeit in different configurations, or by a common motif, like the blue tubes in this one. In others, the two canvases are very different, but the dividing line between them is so blurred that it functions as a cohesive rather than a disintegrative principle. In yet others, the divisions within each part obscure or undo the central partition. And in a particularly wonderful and telling example of this form, because of the title, Mediation, the two canvases are permitted to go about their own business, but are held together by a broad squeegee band of yellow. As the title of this work indicates, Richter is exploring a new kind of analogy, one in which difference predominates over and almost eclipses, or almost erases, but doesn't quite, similarity. He not only relies for this purpose on the axes opened up to him by the Betty photographs, horizontality and verticality, he also treats them as one of the oppositions to be overcome. This is most strikingly the case when a horizontal paint stroke like this one runs across the division between the two canvases. Although these paintings face us instead of inviting us to look down at them, like the 1976 and 77 abstracts, they still feel very topographical. They also invoke a particular topography, the German of the moment in which they were painted, which was divided into two contiguous countries separated by a wall. But Richter was not only thinking about the conditions under which these two Germanys might diverge, but nevertheless coexist. He was also thinking about other geographical partitions and how they might be undone, like the sequestration of Jews and other quote-unquote undesirables in camps that set them apart from the surrounding areas, or the imprisonment of Ensslin and Bader in a high-security prison built especially for them. Richter painted Mediation in 1986, the year in which he and Benjamin Buchloh had their famous and today frequently invoked conversation, their richest exchange, I think. Throughout this conversation, Buchloh pushes Richter to provide a political reading of his work, and Richter repeatedly ducks for cover. But at the end of the conversation, Richter describes his abstract paintings in terms that recall those he used in 1976 when he decided to stop painting gray monochromes and begin working polychromatically. Quote, "I can also see my abstracts as pictures that are about a possibility of social coexistence. Looked at this way, all that I am trying to do in each picture is to bring together the most disparate and mutually contradictory elements, alive and viable, in the greatest possible freedom." I just find that the most extraordinary statement. This is an unbelievably moving account of the analogies that Richter was constructing at this moment in time, particularly when put in relation to the concentration camp and RAF photographs. The worlds those photographs show us are neither alive nor viable, and they couldn't be less free. A year after he painted October 1877, Richter described the series as a leave-taking from three things: the figures to whom the 15 canvases are devoted, the illusions that unacceptable conditions can be changed through violent revolution, and the black and white photo pictures that he had been painting since the mid-60s. He believed that he had laid Meinhof, Ensign, and Botter to rest because he had transformed the horror which the source photographs aroused in him into grief by acknowledging his kinship with the women. He thought that he had dispelled the illusion that unacceptable conditions can be altered through violence by demonstrating that it is possible to mourn the terrorist's death without celebrating their deeds. Finally, Richter imagined that he had said goodbye to black and white photo pictures because he no longer found analogies in which difference is the minimal term compelling. His project now was to accommodate more and more difference. But Richter undercut the first of these claims in another 1989 note. He confesses in a July 25th entry that he is unable to abandon the illusion that unacceptable conditions can be changed through violence. Human beings can't live without believing in the possibility of a better future, he writes. Although most of Richter's post-1988 paintings are abstract, he also did not abandon black and white photo pictures when he finished October 18, 1977. As we will see in a moment, he made one abstract painting by covering a black and white photo picture with white paint, and some of his other abstract paintings could pass for photo pictures. Cage 1 also contains such a picture. In another important passage from this time, Richter acknowledges that he has also been unable to put Meinhof, Enslin, and Botter behind him because he has not fully satisfied the demands made upon him either by the RAF or the concentration camp photographs. Quote, "The death of the terrorists and the 1988 related events, both before and after, stand for a horror that distressed me and has haunted me as unfinished business ever since, despite all my efforts to suppress it," he laments in a 1988 note for a 1989 press conference. Richter also addresses these problems in a contemporaneous abstract cover. He made this 1988 painting by spreading white paint across a photo picture with his squeegee. The photo picture was another version of Hanged, the painting on the left, that Richter had initially planned to include in October 18, 1977, and parts of it are still visible. As I was looking at it yesterday in the show here, I realized not just in the upper left-hand corner, but in many other places in the painting, the underlying photograph is visible. The title of the painting refers not just to the action through which it was created, but also to the blanketing of the ground with snow and the cultural repression through which Ensslin, Meinhof, and Baader's corpses were made to disappear. The spectral corner of the upper corner of the underlying photo picture that is still visible indicates that their second burial, the one Richter conducted, may also have been premature because one of their spirits is still abroad. The RAF was unfinished business in part because Richter had focused on the figures whose violence was grounded in and therefore could be to some degree justified by ideology, Meinhof and Ensslin. He defined the RAF as a women's movement, and what he does with Ensslin and Meinhof is extraordinary, I think. He not only claims them as his kin, he also resurrects Meinhof in Youth Portrait and Ensslin in the three confrontation canvases, and he releases their bodies from the objectifying scrutiny to which the source photographs subjected them in both hanged and in the three dead paintings. However, Richter treats Baader very differently. He does not connect this figure to anyone he loves or make a painting of him based on a photograph taken of him when he was still alive. And although he blurred the source photographs for Man Shot Down 1 and 2 before painting them, and does the same with the paintings, he does not render the paintings any less degrading than the source photographs, and he leaves Baader's corpse lying where the prison photographer found it. Richter goes, I should have had that one slide earlier. That's hanged with the source photograph. Richter goes to even greater lengths to separate himself from Baader in Cell, which you all can go back and study because it's also in the show. This painting is based on a photograph of Baader's prison cell, the most prominent feature of which is a tall bookcase filled with books. Richter blurred this photograph before working with it, as he did with all the others. He was clearly dissatisfied because he re-photographed it with an even softer focus, and that was also clearly insufficient to the task at hand because he does something with this painting that he does not do with any of the other works in the series. He blurs the painting vertically. At first, this verticality seems to have been inspired by the bookcase, but soon this analogy yields to another. The vertical blurring points back to the vertical strokes in the abstracts Richter painted immediately prior to October 18th, 1977. It also both reactivates and extends a series of associations they triggered. Water seems to be running down the painting, dissolving the image, and actually collecting in the base of the painting, as I also noted yesterday. Richter horizontally blurs the shelves of the bookcase, which softens the effect of the verticality on the right side of the canvas. But he stops doing that at a certain point, and then the blurring is entirely vertical, and it's as if the lower shelf is a water line. Water seems to be running down the painting, dissolving the image, and evoking not just morally unmarked concepts like liquid and tears, but also overtly destructive concepts like liquidation and dissolution. Once again, there is an absent body. The photographer, at first glance, this body is Baader's, but closer scrutiny suggests otherwise. The photographer appears to have been outside the cell when he shot the source photograph. The vertical blurring locates Richter outside this room. It also installs a row of bars between him and Baader. Richter's reluctance to see himself in Baader is completely understandable. The terrorist was a profoundly disturbing figure, autocratic, sexist, and abusive. Unlike Ensslin and Meinhof, whose actions were an extension of their political beliefs, Botter's were unsullied by ideology. He represented what Freud would call a pure culture of the death drive. But by vertically blurring cell, Richter reestablishes the binary opposition that he dismantles with the women. He also aligns himself with Botter's jailers. Finally, he denies that he too is not only mortal, but also capable of non-ideological violence. Richter clearly came to see this himself because he acknowledges that religious and/or ideological belief is not the only source of human violence in a very amazing 1989 note. In the present, he writes, and as far back as we can see into the past, reality takes the form of an unbroken set of cruelties. It pains, maltreats, and kills us. It is unjust, pitiless, pointless, and hopeless. We are at its mercy, and we are it. Richter started painting the abstracts, let's just call them the vertical abstracts. I did mean, of course, to point attention to this analogy. But I had so many slides that I couldn't show them all today, and I was frantically cutting them back today, and a few are out of order. Richter started painting the abstracts with the irresistibly associative vertical strokes again as soon as he finished October 18, 1977. In many of them, torrents of water seemed to cascade downward, sometimes morphing into snow or freezing into ice. And Richter encourages us to read them in this way by giving some of them titles like Water. A few of the vertical abstracts also seem to be covering over an underlying layer of paint or a photograph, something that looks photographic, although it is never identified as such. Soon, though, Richter starts making room within these paintings for horizontal movement, sometimes as an alternative in alternating canvases, and sometimes as here within the same canvas. He seems to be trying to do in these works what he was trying to do in the earlier two canvas abstractions, to create analogies that are capable of accommodating heterogeneous and even contradictory terms. But these single canvas cohabitations are much tenser than those in the two canvas works because there is less internal differentiation within each of the linked terms. Unlike Ozu in two parts and mediation, where the relationship between the elements within each canvas is as complex and interesting as the relationship of the two canvases to each other, the contrast between horizontality and verticality is usually stark and repetitive. Richter returned to the two canvas form early in 1989 as the East-West binary began to crumble. But instead of creating a group of individual works, as he did earlier in the 80s, he created a trilogy. He also introduces a vertical dimension into a form that had previously been strictly spatial. Richter titled these three canvases November, December, and January. When viewed in the order that I just showed them to you, we appear to be moving into an ever deeper state of winter. And so the trilogy analogizes the movement from late fall to deep winter through the gradual dissipation of the fog-like blur that is so marked in November and the buildup of white paint that reaches its apex in January. But Richter painted these works in reverse chronological order, and he also hangs them that way. We are consequently obliged to read backward as well as forward in time, and our backward journey takes us to the threshold of a highly significant month, the one named in the title of October 18, 1977. Richter also links November to October visually. The fog-like blur in the center of the painting recalls the ghostly blur in Hanged. Cements this connection by covering over the second version of Hanged with snow, just as January does with the foggy blur of November. And here's cover again. Although January, December, and November trigger seasonal rather than topographical associations, Richter was clearly thinking once again about the GDR and the FRG, in both of which he had lived, and he had almost always mapped all other binary oppositions that preoccupied him onto that one. Not only does each painting consist of 2 canvases, but all 3 are large enough to fill a wall. And although the white shapes on the left side of November resemble poplars or birches, I think, after hearing Mark's talk, suggesting that we are looking at a wooded area, the dark background in December is starting to solidify into a surface on which icicles can form, and by the time we get to January, it seems a wall on which snow has fallen and ice has formed. This proximity might seem to link them with the earlier 2 canvas works, but proximity now no longer signifies coexistence. Although the GDR kept an entire population, as Richter put it, casually cooped up like convicts for 40 years, he was unable to celebrate what happened in 1989. The lifting of the travel restrictions that had prevented citizens of the GDR from traveling to the FRG was not, in his opinion, a concession on the part of the government to the demands of a democratic revolution. It was, rather, an imposition from above. Richter was also skeptical about the other player in this drama. As the dramatic events leading to reunification were unfolding, West German audiences were viewing October 18, 1977, and their reactions were not encouraging. Leftists excoriated the artist for painting photographs that belonged to them, not him, and conservatives blasted him for sympathizing with the RAF. If West Germans were unable to say both the terrorists and the state, they would never agree to say both the GDR and the FDR. There was only one way reunification could proceed, through the brutal assimilation of the East to the West. It was time to stop dreaming of countries shaped like 2 canvas abstracts. In June 1989, Jan Toorn Pricker told Richter that many viewers were probably angry about October 18 because it fulfills a quote-unquote hate fantasy. Many Germans would like nothing more than to see Meinhof, Ensslin, and Bader dead, and October 18 satisfies that wish. Richter's lengthy response shows that he was still thinking about analogy as a way of accommodating contradictory terms, and that he was still interested also in a maximum amount of contradiction and the maximum amount of viability and freedom. However, it also shows that he had begun conceptualizing this both and relationship in a new way as something that has to be implemented psychically, either because there is no other way of affecting it or because this psychic implementation will perhaps permit it to be later socially implemented. Quote, "I do know that the hate fantasy exists, but it's more complicated than that. If people wanted to see the RAF hanged as criminals, that's only part of it. There's something else that puts an additional fear into people, namely that they themselves are terrorists, and that is forbidden. So this terrorism inside all of us, that's what generates the fear and rage. That's what I don't want, any more than I want the policeman inside myself. There's never just one side to us. We're always both, the state and the terrorist. Richter had clearly been thinking along these lines for a while because he shot, in May 1989, he shot 6 photographs called 6 Photos, as all the photographs are out of focus, strongly resemble the cell-like image in panel 27. They have figures, all of them shadowy figures, so there's somebody in these cells, unlike the one in the atlas. And as this all-important photograph in the series show, they are all variants of Richter. He sits on the ground facing us, and he is dressed in a striped shirt, reminiscent of those worn by concentration camp inmates. As I looked closely at it yesterday, because it's also here, almost everything I talk about is, which is fabulous, I noticed that although the stripes run in they run vertically on the shirt, which is very crumpled, but they run horizontally around the collar. He sits on the ground facing us, and he is dressed in a striped shirt reminiscent of those worn by concentration camp inmates. Most of the stripes are vertical, but they run horizontally in the area around the collar. 2 other figures lean over of him, one of whom is also recognizably Richter, who appear to be guards. I am mortal like those who died in the camps, Richter says in this series of photographs. I also harbor the wish to kill like those who exterminated them. In 1990, the photograph in panel 27 of the atlas moved a little closer to becoming a painting. Richter struck new prints from the negatives for 6 photos. I don't know really what verb now to use given today's talks. Smeared, dripped, smudged lavender paint on them, and foregrounded their biographical significance by titling the new series Misty Self-Portrait. In 1996, Richter also did what he had been unable to do in October 18, 1977, acknowledged that he had the capacity to act as Botter had acted, to be violent without an ideological motive. He painted 2 self-portraits that year, and in one of them, which is also in the show, he looks mournfully downward. He blurred this self-portrait vertically, just as he had earlier done with Cell. Once again, though, there is a crucial difference. The watery barrier that had earlier separated him from Botter's empty room now separates us from him. He is both inside the painting and inside the cell. But there is another reason why the RAF was unfinished business. In 2000, Richter produced several versions of an offset print of an aerial photograph of Dresden, shot by an Allied bomber after its fiery destruction. Pillows of smoke hover in the air, intervening between us and the city below, much as the out-of-scale strokes and smudges in some of Richter's soft abstracts intervene between us and the imaginary landscapes below. The following year, the artist flew to New York for the opening of an exhibition of his work at the Marion Goodman Gallery. He boarded the plane on September 1, 2011, and he was in the air. He was in a plane in the air when the 2 planes flew into the Twin Towers, precipitating another massive conflagration and triggering an avalanche of additional analogies. The destruction of the World Trade Center was an act of terrorism, like the acts for which the RAF was imprisoned, and it pushed the binary opposition to its absolute limit, just as the Third Reich and the FRG had done. Like the RAF, the United States enforced this binary from the other side, and it did so in ways that recalled Auschwitz and Stammheim. It imprisoned those deemed to be terrorists in prisons outside the U.S., geographically separated, sequestered areas, most notoriously Abu Ghraib and the detention and interrogation center on the Guantanamo Naval Base. The U.S. also justified this by proclaiming the terrorists to be absolutely evil, in other words, by ontologically nullifying them, and declared a state of exception that allowed for the torture of non-Americans and curtailed its citizens' own rights. Last but not least, the United States reduced 2 countries to rubble, just as Allied bombers did to Dresden. Richter's response to this explosion of analogies was strangely muted. He returned to Germany the next day from Canada without reaching New York, and a year later he told Jürgen Hohmeier that, quote, 9/11 didn't affect me in the personal kind of way that the terror of the RAF did. In 2004, Richter published War Cut, a book in which he juxtaposed enlarged details from one of his paintings with passages from newspaper articles about the Iraq War. He told Pricker that he based these juxtapositions on strictly aesthetic criteria rather than the content of the passages, and that the Iraq War wouldn't be happening. He couldn't say that it wasn't necessary because it wouldn't be happening if it weren't necessary. He ended the interview in an unnervingly upbeat note, quote, "It was fun to have produced something as beautiful as War Cut, something story-like, something fantastic, the exact opposite of war." But in 2004, Richter made 4 drawings of mysterious vertical shapes, and when Buchloh pointed to the visual similarities between them and the Twin Towers, he was surprised, but then agreed. The same thing happened when he talked with interviewers about other works from this period. When Pricker asked him why there are 11 panes of glass and 11 panes, Richter couldn't think of a single reason. But when Pricker said that the number 11 made him think of September 11, Richter approved this interpretation. He responds in a similar way when Pricker says that the photographs in War Cut look like the aerial photographs of, quote, oil fields on fire and pools of oil, and that sometimes ghosts, death's heads, and hideous faces seem to emerge from the images, even though he, that is Richter, has just asserted the priority of colors and structures over meaning. The most startling of all of these delayed recognitions occurred during a 2004 conversation with Buchloh. The conversation began with a discussion of the Silicate series, a group of paintings from the preceding year that are loosely based on a scientific image of something that cannot be either photographed or seen, the electron clouds of a silicate atom. Although these paintings resemble the Gray paintings in some ways, they have a repetitive structure not previously seen in Richter's work. He told Buchloh that he used a stenciling system to make them that allowed each individual form to be, quote, exactly where it belongs, close quote, and to look, quote, the same as all the others, close quote. Richter also extols the beauty of the resulting patterns, which he compares to the work of Sol LeWitt. But when Buchloh responds that the structures are quite cell-like and that they, quote, convey an experience between hermetic seriality and control, between computer cells and mass structures, that is quite depressing, close quote, the scales fall from Richter's eyes. Yes, he responds, yes, that's true. You've come quickly to the point. This really is a quite terrifying thematic, like getting closer to the end in the direction of death and dissolution, down to the very elements where all that is left are these dread atomic structures. Richter was slow to grasp the implications of all of these works because of an extremely disturbing analogy, one that linked him to the pilots of the hijacked planes. Not only was he flying to New York at the moment when those planes hit the two towers, but he too was strangely obsessed with New York skyscrapers. There are many photographs of New York and the Atlas, virtually all of the city's tall buildings, in some of which the World Trade Center can be glimpsed. Richter also wrote an astonishing note about New York and its skyscrapers during a 1984 visit to the city. Quote, "The more New York fascinates me, the more I suppress the overwhelming rage and hostility that I feel towards this city in all its magnificence, modernity, beauty, and above all, its incomparable, unmatchable vitality, which are denied to me and which I can only admire, full of envy and raging, impotent, hateful jealousy. This city of the elect and the privileged, of wielders of power and decision makers, which implacably raises up and destroys. This city, this monster, with its tall old buildings that seem so familiar and cozy and convey such a sense of security," close quote. Richter concludes this note with the words, "I shall rebook tomorrow and fly home early," which is also what he did on another September day, 17 years later. Now, the wish that subtends this note, the unconscious or half-conscious wish that subtends this note, has been fulfilled. The monster city that implacably raises up and destroys us, destroys him implicitly, has also been brought low. But it wasn't just that Richter saw New York skyscrapers as a potent symbol of its power and dominance and resented this dominance. He also wished to be one of those raised up, one of its elect. And in the 17-year interval between September 1984 and September 2001, this wish had also come true. New York had elevated him like one of its tall old buildings, and he had reciprocated its love, selling October 18, 1977 to MoMA rather than a German museum. And in 2002, when MoMA exhibited the series, the city had also betrayed his love. Asked about the relationship between the series and September 11, the curator of the show said that the series should help us to see that those responsible for the destruction of the World Trade Center are, quote, "not monsters, but rather people, very much like ourselves," close quote. What kind of mind is it that at this stage of the game refuses to distinguish between good and evil, civilization and barbarism? Eric Gibson savagely responded in an essay on the Wall Street Journal. No wonder that it took Richter so long to acknowledge that he had been affected by 9/11. He was both in the exploding towers and in the planes that destroyed them. In 2005, Richter painted a photo picture based on a photograph of the burning towers, which he initially called September 2001 and later shortened to September, thereby connecting it to January, December, November, and October 18, 1977. Modestly scaled, it positions what seem, I keep studying it, what seem to be three vertical shapes, two darker ones and one gray-shaped one, but he eventually decided to destroy it in another way, one that analogizes the destruction that it shows. He scratched the canvas horizontally numerous times with a knife. Some of these scratches are much deeper than the others and hit, quote unquote, the columns at a point comparable to that at which the planes hit the towers. Quote from Richter, "Only after I destroyed the painting was it fit to be seen," close quote. The following year, Richter began working on a series of paintings based on an image similar to the one he used in the Silicate series, but he strangely lost the desire after he'd been working on them for a while, so he painted over what he had previously done and then continued painting until he had the 6 cage abstract paintings. Although he eventually decided to include Cage 1 in this series, he hesitated about it for a long time because it is so different from the others. It is with a necessarily very, very brief discussion of this painting that I will end my talk. Richter worked on Cage 1 he worked on all of them for a long time, but I'm only talking about this one. So let's just say he worked on this painting for a long time, and he documented the stages, presumably not every stage, but many stages. The earliest of these photographs, which is the one on the left, shows a white canvas with what appear to be blurry lines of numbers or words. In the second photograph, the one next to it, these numbers or words have very, very importantly become black stripes against a black background. And just to draw that analogy home, and as you will see, the stripes keep reappearing in ways that are very astonishing. So stage 3 and stage 3, they're still clearly visible. And stage 4, which you're looking at, they show through almost like trees, birch trees. And then we get to the most amazing stages of all, I think, where I checked with his studio, where he actually overpainted the underlying layers in these almost festive, almost party favor ways. And here he is working on one of those stages. And in the last two, the stripes begin to be barely discernible in the final canvas. I thought until I had time to study it here that the only place it appears is in the very narrow column that runs the full length of the canvas of little white and gray stripes. But I saw that actually there are traces of it all over the canvas. So these stripes resurface in one form or another in all of the other photographs, either behind other layers of paint or on top of them. The stripes always run horizontally, which is also the direction of those slats I mentioned, I asked you to look at in the camp photograph. But in the final version of the painting, they are confined primarily, but not exclusively, to a narrow vertical band on the right side. Cage 1 has a number of deep horizontal scratches and many birch-like shapes that rhyme with this vertical band, and the two begin to blur into each other to become almost undecidable which you are looking at, but always with this unambiguous stripe here to reference all the others too. So vertical and horizontal scratches and vertical shapes with these little bars. These intersecting lines give the painting a cage-like structure. It also resembles a cage in another way. The Tate catalog includes photographs of Richter working on the cage paintings, and as we can see, he often used enormous squeegees. I'm just going to run through these. He used enormous squeegees that limited him to painting either vertically or horizontally. He is a prisoner in a cell, but one of his own making. Like Osama bin Laden, I have dreamt of blowing up the World Trade Center, he says as he moves in one direction. Like so many of the other people who visit this monster of New York, I have also longed for it to elevate me, like one of its skyscrapers, he says as he moves in the other direction, and it has fulfilled this dream. I am both a prisoner in a concentration camp and Deutschland über alles, Andreas Bader, and his jailer, Dresden after the destruction of the city, and those who drop, and inside the planes that drop bombs on the city beneath. And each time he drags his giant implement across the canvas, he both covers what lies behind and uncovers it. In a 2007 conversation with Hans Ulrich Obrist, Richter said that the canvases in this series are his freest paintings. He also told Obrist that he finds them hopeful. These might seem odd concepts to associate with a cage, odd to associate a cage with hope or to say that it is liberating to be behind its bars. However, the both-and analogies through which Richter imprisons himself in cage create a relational field and make this little room an everywhere. Let me read that last sentence again because I botched it. However, the both-and analogies through which Richter imprisons himself in cage create a vast relational field and make this little room an everywhere. That's the end. Thank you very much. It goes on in the Atlas. I mean, the story will never end, but the talk had to.
Okay, we probably have about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions, could they put their hands up, please? Coming over to you now.
Thank you very much. Well, it's quite interesting, amazing talk about Richter's painting. And then especially I'm interested in the idea of your verticality and horizontality as a formal analogy through which we can see some strengths, through which we can see many variety of Richter's works in a very interestingly in the way that he like you said, that abstract paintings that we can see some lines or vertical and horizontal, and then it can also be seen in the photo paintings, especially in the October series, and also the self-portraits. And then I'm just wondering that if there are any other formal analogy, like the depth, like abstract painting, we can see that, although Richter's used the squeezy from left to right, he just, dragged that.
Right.
It's also the motion or the movement on the two-dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, it's very astonishing.
But also has the layers, like some of the abstract paintings, and upstairs we can see that some scrapes that he tried to show, reveal the hidden paint. And it means like kind of, there's also the three-dimensional or non-two-dimensional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's in a cage, so there are three ways to move: horizontally, vertically, and back and forth. And he's doing all of those at once. I talk about the depth issue in my other essay, and also I was at the absolute limit of how long I could talk tonight. But I will also say that I think that had been a redemptive thing for him, connected to the recovery of and redemption of the past. And I think that redemptive possibility gets closed off for him really around the time of reunification. And I think because the past keeps returning from the future, and that's a very Heideggerian formulation, that the past comes to us from the future. And hence the overpainting of the gray stripes, that complicates the uncovering gesture. It suggests that you can scrape down, but it can return from ahead of us or from in front of us. It can come back from the future. So we haven't really, we're not starting from zero. We're never starting from zero. And then, you know, there are just tons and tons of things that could be said about the scraping, the squeegee and what it allows him to do. And the catalog essays are full of people talking in a very informed and insightful way. So I strongly recommend those essays to you. And Mark also today talked about verticality in his excellent talk.
Kaja, there's a lot to respond to in your amazing paper. And I'm going to pick up what might be a sort of predictable aspect of it, one that interests me no end. And the question comes in really in the form of an invitation to spell out in more detail something I'm sure you've thought about, and that is the fate of the dynamic of horizontal and vertical as you spelled it out in gendered terms, and in familial terms.
Right.
And the invitation, the hope is that you could speak to that now about the Richter that you see today.
Yeah.
And
that's a really great question. I had been very aware as I was writing of his desire to make one of these axes function redemptively, like as in mediation, where it's horizontality, and horizontality does come to occupy that role for quite a long period of time. But yes, when he upends the photograph of Betty, but then he associates verticality with her, but he's also associating it with the fatality, with the death of Meinhof and Enslin. So his daughter is a stand-in for those figures. So I think as late as Cell, there's still a sense that this is the fatal level. Verticality is the fatal level, and if we can just move horizontally, we can cancel it or contain it or mitigate it. But I think by the time he's pacing the cell of cage one, there's no fixed meaning to either one of them. There's just the unending imperative to say both and, both and, both and. It's as if you've never said it finally, you've never said it fully. And of course, the photographs in September 11 show. Let's go back to his painting because it makes that so obvious. This isn't my Mac, and I'm a little. Am I doing the right thing? Is it actually moving? It's moving on my screen, but not there.
Just a sec, reconnect.
Do what? Oh, okay. Okay. So, of course, this is the astonishing moment that may be what undoes any attempt to associate horizontality with viability, freedom, anything that could be socially redemptive, because we have the vertical towers that go back to the implacable skyscrapers, and that is the dimension that he is associated with fatality, but the planes are coming, they're moving through it. And he marks that so dramatically, almost like the tails of the planes and the left hand of the canvas. So I think, it's a really great question that you asked, Anne, and I think it may be a necessary undoing, because that's a binary, that is marked in some way, and you haven't said both and until you've let go of that.
a wonderfully compelling lecture. I think we're all a little stunned. What I wanted to ask was, I suppose the general kind or recurring question that occurs to me as you go along is, you seem very certain about his psychological state, his manner of thinking, his inner world at different times, and his sense of that. And
how is it that I can have that certainty?
Indeed. Your story is marvelously complex and revealing and fruitful and so on. And yet there is that question that arises, isn't there?
Oh, no, absolutely. Let's just say that I have tracked it so closely in his interviews, his notebooks, and in the atlas. This most recent time was my second period of dwelling with it, because I had written an earlier essay that worked through the daughter-father stuff in a very detailed way. But he's very after I finished my earlier essay, which is called Photography by Other Means, and was in which these two Betty paintings, the blurred one that is mysteriously lost, and the other, the butcher block one, Babette Richter, Betty, now with an adult name, who has become a kind of media personality in Germany, does an interview with Richter, and they talk very openly about what she was being asked to do at that period in time. So I find it, I mean, which of any of us would have left that passage about New York in the republished version of the notes and interviews, etc.? He's so, I find the willingness to just not take positions that are politically correct, but ones that are going to put him at immediate risk and to make declarations and interviews and to publish notes that lays that morass, that psychic morass out there. Stunning, it's absolutely staggering, and it seems such an important part of the project. And I guess I have this same, not brilliance, of course, but the same kind of associative intelligence. So I just, I was going back to the concentration camp photographs, and there's studio, and I just been looking at Cage, and I just been thinking, why horizontality and verticality? It's like pacing back and forth in a cage. Anyway, I tracked it very, very closely, and I've only shared maybe half of what I found. There's so much more that I think reinforces this reading. But he's told the story. I'm just tracking it.
Thank you, Kaja, for that very intense and powerful account. But I want to ask you something about the relationship of your idea of analogy, which I thought was incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
And your claim, which I completely agree with, which is the terms of photography and the terms of abstraction are kind of changed in the process through Richter's work. But I had a kind of unease and resistance to what also felt like a kind of metaphorics that was playing alongside your idea of analogy. And I wondered whether you think that idea of a metaphorics is just very alien to the way you're accounting for the work, and B, what room you have for that kind of the historicity of abstraction itself in terms of its own formal means.
Yeah. Well, as Anne and Tim, who are sitting over there, can tell you, I'm a newcomer to the world of painting. I started working on painting with Richter. That's where I started. So my formation is not as an art historian. I have apparently become one. I just taught a survey of contemporary art class all the way through to the end. I fooled most of the people most of the time, apparently, right? Yeah. I have a different formation, so my way into this is going to be somewhat different, which is not to say that I'm not trying to learn how to do it by the book. I am trying to learn how to do it by the book. I knew that you were going to ask me some question like that because of your own line of questioning during the last panel discussion. And I was already mobilizing my answer. Now, I have come to see that, not just that for Richter at least, and he's incredibly insistent upon there are so many places where he insists upon similitude as the organizing condition of all of his work. But I have come to see that miraculously in his hands, abstract painting is more associative than a photograph ever could be. That a photograph connects the two terms of the analogy, which, as I said before, I'm thinking as equal, ontologically equal, so not a representation and then the thing that is represented, but two equal terms that are divided by a small difference. That because the two things in a photographic analogy resemble each other so much, it's as if all of the associational possibilities are exhausted by those two terms. Whereas an abstract painting throws the door wide open. It can embrace a vast number of relational terms. So it's actually far from the way it is the abstract expression is thought of it, or Clement Greenberg, let's say Clement Greenberg as closed, non-referential, referring only to itself. That in the hands of Richter is the exact opposite of that. But it's because we're stuck on this referentiality issue that we keep stubbing our toes on that, because not only are we not talking about referentiality and when photography, when Richter's working with it, but we aren't talking about referentiality with painting, abstract painting. We're talking about analogy. And I'm not going to try to recapitulate my whole book, Flesh of My Flesh, on this topic, because I think I've done already a great deal of talking, but it's an enormously complex relationship. And for Richter, and I know for me, and I think for Richter, it's our only salvation. It's all we have left. It's the only principle of hope. So saying, I am Andreas Bader and I am his jailer. I was in the tower and I was in the plane that flew into the tower. That's the kind of ethical work of leaving no term unlinked, of not leaving anything outside. I remember when the Iraq War was going on, I used to live in Oakland, and one of my neighbors had a bumper sticker that I loved, and I'm not a bumper sticker lover, and this one began with the word God that I'm also not very enamored of, but it said, God bless everyone, period, no exceptions. So if we could imagine the bless everyone by connecting, relating yourself to them in a way that is difficult, period, no exceptions, then we would be, that's all we have, I think. I feel that we've lost all of our bases of political hope. We're in a completely ruined universe, I think. Shouldn't end that way. But Richter will save you. Go to the show.